I want to talk a bit more about animations. Specifically, I want to cover another concept called tweens. And tweens are not essential to make a good game in Godot, but they can make your life significantly easier. At this point, we can animate basically any property using an animation player. The thing is, sometimes you just want to have a simple animation, like zooming in with the camera, updating a position, or changing the transparency. All of these things are quite simple, and as a consequence, an animation player for them would be overkill. To remedy that situation, we have tweens. And basically what they are, most importantly, they are not a node, although they used to be in earlier versions of Godot. Instead, they are an object that you create in the script of a node. And then this tween object can interpolate between two values. This might sound confusing, so let's do an example. We want to rotate any kind of node, doesn't really matter what it is. For that, we are setting a start value, an end value, and a duration. With that information, the tween object can start at a certain point. In this case, we would have a rotation of 0 degrees at 0 seconds, and then over the duration of 1 second, we would go through all of the values and eventually end up at the final value, the one we have specified. All of this would take just a couple of lines of code, no dedicated node, and is very easy to work with. Once again, here we are back in Godot. And what I want to do is that if the player is entering this house, I want to zoom in on the player, which means inside of the player, we have the camera 2D, and this one has a zoom level. If the player is entering the area 2D of the house, then I want to increase the zoom level to whatever value we want. Let's say if I go to 1, then, okay, you can't really see the outcome, but if I zoom in, this pink reddish area is the camera zoom. So if we change this to a 1, it is much closer to the player. Although this is not the value I want. For now, I want to keep it at 0.6. For that though, first of all, we need to have a bit of a setup. And first of all, I want to close the light fan animation and the grenade. We don't need those anymore. Instead, I want to work inside of the house. This one is now going to need a script. So I'm going to attach a script. For the template, I want to have an empty one, and the folder should be in the same folder where we have the house. All of this looks pretty good. Now we have a script, and next up, with the house node selected, I want to click on node, and then look at body entered. I want to trigger this signal once the player has entered, and for now, let me simply print player has entered. Also, while we are here, let me check the house area 2D in the inspector for the collisions. Those look good. The house is on layer 5 and can only see the player. Whenever you check collisions, this is a really important tab. It's very easy to mess up. Now, with that, we should be printing something. And let's test it. That's usually what you want to do very often. So there we already get an issue that we get players entered many, many times. Although we are also getting it when the player is actually entering. To check what's going wrong here, let me print the body that we are getting. And let's try all of this again. And there we can see the simple light is causing the problem along with the wall light. For those, we have to update the collision layers. Which means I want to open up the wall light and I want to open up I called it the simple light. Both of those have the wrong collision layer. And I really want to emphasize this, you always want to keep in mind. It's very easy to forget. It should not be layer 1. Instead, it should be on layer 3 for objects. And for the mask, it can see the player, it can see the enemies, and it can see the projectiles. With that, we can save it. And then for the simple light, I want to have the same. It should be on layer 3 and can see layers 1, 2, and 4. And with that, I should be able to close both of these, run all of this again. And now there's no print statement when we are running the game. And if I walk into all of this, we are getting the player. And this works multiple times, so this is looking really good. That is a good start. Next up, I want to connect this house to the level, or more specifically, the signal we have just created, this one here, this needs to trigger a function inside of the level, which we can do via a signal. So I want to create a signal. Let's call it player entered. And instead of printing something, I simply want to get the player entered and then emit all of that. Now with that, back inside of the level, I can get inside of ground, we have the house, and now the house has player entered as a signal. This I want to connect to the level script, and now we get on house player entered. Just to make sure that this one is still working, I want to print player has entered house in level. It's really important to always double check your code, and especially when you're recording, all of this gets significantly more difficult. But this is looking really good. So finally, we can start creating a tween. The way you're doing that is, first of all, you want to get the tree. This is a function that returns the node tree, basically the entire scene we currently have. And this one has a couple of methods. The one we want to use is called createTween. Also function, and a function that doesn't need any arguments. So this would create a tween object. This we want to store in a variable right away. Let's call it var tween. And now we have a tween, although this doesn't do anything. Instead, what you now have to do is get this tween and then run tween underscore property. And let me extend this window so we can see what's going on. This tween property method wants to have at least 4 arguments, but we have received 0 so far, so we have to make some updates. Also, a really useful tip, if you hold Control or Command and space, then you can see what Godot specifically wants for this method. And number 1, it wants an object. Most of the time, the object is going to be a node. In our case, the object would be the camera 2D. So inside of the player, we have a camera 2D. Next up, we want to have the property on this node that we want to change. Which means if I minimize this window and go to camera 2D in the inspector, there we have zoom. And if you hover over that, we get zoom. This is the property we want to address. And importantly, this property Godot wants to have as a string. So on string, zoom, the name of this property, and then we're good to go. And once again, let me extend this. We will need 2 more attributes. Godot wants to have the final value and the duration. Now, for zoom, the value Godot wants is going to be a vector 2. With 2 values, let's go with 1 and 1 for x and y values. And finally, we need a duration, and this is in seconds. So if you add a 1 here, we have a 1 second duration. And now Godot is not complaining anymore, and this should be working. So let's try all of this. And I can walk towards the house, and once we are entering the area 2D, we can see our camera is zooming in. So this is working really well. I can still do everything else, so I am quite happy with that. Perfect. I really hope you understand why the system is incredibly powerful. If the player is entering the house, we only want to zoom in, so ultimately a fairly simple operation. We could accomplish all of this using an animation player, but it would be way too much work, which is why you're seeing tweens all over the place. They make your life much easier, although you could get by without them. However, with that being said, if I run all of this again and I go into the house, so just a second, the animation still works, but the issue we have now is that if the player is leaving the house, the camera doesn't return back to the default state. And fixing that is going to be your exercise. I want you guys to change the camera zoom back to the start value of 0.6 for both x and y once the player is leaving the house. Pause the video now and try to implement that. I want to start working on the house because in there we have to attach a new signal, which is body exited. I want to add that to the house, and now we have a new function. Although this is local to the house scene, so we have to create another signal. Let's call it player exited. Once we have that, all we have to do is get player exited and then emit this signal. With that, we can return to the level scene, select inside of the ground, the house, and now we have another signal. This we want to trigger and connect it to the level script. Let me get rid of the white space and extend the window. Inside of this function, we now want to create a new tween and use that to update the camera once again. For that, once again, I want to create a new variable with tween. And this one is going to get tree. And then on that, I want to create a tween. On the next line, I want to use this tween object and then run the method tween property. And once again, we're going to need 4 arguments. First of all, we need an object, which in our case is the player camera. So I want to have the player and then the camera 2D. Once again, we want to target the zoom. So as a string, I want to add zoom. Next up, we want to return to the start value, which was vector 2 and 0.6 and 0.6. Finally, for the 4th value, we need a duration. And just to have something else, let's say 2 seconds. Once we have all of that, Godot stops complaining. We can run the game again. And now if I go into the house, this should still work. And that is looking really good. And now if I leave the house, we are going back to the default camera zoom. And, well, we can do this multiple times. This works really well. Cool, I'm happy with this. With that, we have the basics of tweens. Now that being said, you can do quite a few more things with them. Although before I get to them, the debugger is complaining and this I don't like. Basically, we are using body inside of these 2 signals. And Godot doesn't like that, so we have to add an underscore so the debugger stops complaining. This is a smaller issue, but you don't want to have too many debugger issues. At some point, they are going to become annoying and confusing. If we now run all of this again, the debugger is happy, so everything is good. Now with that covered, we can look at a few more extra functionalities of tweens that can also be super useful. Right now, we have one animation when the player is entering the house and another animation when the player is leaving. If you want to have something a bit more fancy, you could add multiple animations on one tween. For example, what we could be doing. If I want to add another animation, I would simply add tween again, then use tween property once more. Let's say as an example, I want to make the player invisible. For that, I want to get the player, or the player node to be more specific. Next up, the property I want to target is modulate. This property covers the color and the transparency of any node. Ultimately, it is a vector 4 with 4 values. We have a value for the red color, for green, for blue, and then for the alpha values, which we cover with A. Now, in our case, we don't really want to target all of them. All we care about is the alpha value. And for that, Godot has a nice shortcut. You can use a colon and then lowercase a. With that, we are only targeting one value inside of this property. And this value we want to set to 0. Finally, for the duration, let's say I want to have a duration of 2 seconds. And with that, if I now run all of this again, I can move the player to the house. And now we are zooming in. And after we have done that, the player becomes invisible. And we still have the shadows, so everything else works fine. But, well, now we have an invisible player. Which is illustrating one major issue, that we are first playing this animation, and then we are playing the other animation. Godot plays them in sequence, which means if I turn all of this around and have modulate first, and then the zoom, you can kind of tell where this is going. We are going to have first the transparency and then the camera. So now the player becomes invisible, and then we are zooming in. Sometimes this is the desired behavior, but most of the time it is not. To play both of these animations in parallel, you would get the tween and then the method set parallel, and you would set this one to true or false depending on what you want. In my case, I want this to be true. Which means if I run all of this now, we can walk in there and we would get the animation and, well, we would get both animations for the camera and for the transparency. You might have also seen, let's say, if I type tween again and then set, we can also set a loops. So if you want to play an animation multiple times, you could do it with that one. Although I am not going to do that, that's something slightly more advanced. Or not really more advanced, just slightly different, and I am not going to need it. Instead, I want to cover something else. And that is, when you are tweening a property, you can add a tiny bit more. For example, right now, we are setting the player, we're getting transparency, and we are only setting the end value and the duration. What we can also do is set a start value. This you get by adding a dot and then the from method. In there, you can simply set a start value. For example, if I set this to 0.5, then let me actually demonstrate what's going to happen. If I now run into the house, we are going to transition the player almost immediately to half transparency, and then we are moving to 0 transparency. By default, Godot is going to start with the current value of the player, which is 1, so full transparency. But if you want to have a default start value, you could use from. Besides that, you could also set a transition speed. For example, right now we are zooming in with the camera, and this works at a linear speed. But sometimes you don't want to have a linear speed. And for that, you can add another method called set trans for set transition. And in there, you get a whole bunch of different kinds of transitions. For example, I guess trans quad should be visible. If I now run all of this, you might be able to see this or you might not. For this kind of animation, it's a bit hard to see. So there we are zooming in seemingly faster, but we're not actually doing that. Let me draw this actually. When you think about transitioning any kind of property, you would have two axes. On the x-axis, you would have time, and on the y-axis, you would have some kind of value. The simplest transition to understand is a linear one. This one simply moves at a straight line. However, this is not always what you want to have. Sometimes you want to have an animation transition that looks something like this, or something like this, or even something like this. All of these you could set with set trans. Now in my case, I will not be too concerned about this, but this is also something you can do. Tweens are actually quite powerful in Godot. Although at some point, if you add too many things inside of this tween, you might simply want to use an animation player. There's no hard line between which one you should be using. At some point, you're just going to get a feeling for it, but both are perfectly fine approaches. In my case though, I want to comment out the modulate because this is not something we are going to need. Now finally, there's one more thing that I want to do. If I go back to the main scene, when the player is entering this area. So far, I can actually demonstrate this. The player can keep on moving, so this is not ideal. Instead, what I want to do is if the player is entering this area, I want to transition the player speed to 0. What that is going to mean is that the player is moving normally, and once we are entering, we are slowing down the player, so we are ending up somewhere here. That way, the player is never going to reach this bit, which would look a bit unrealistic. For that, we will need a few more things. It's not too much. Back in the player, I want to work in the script, and I want to give the player a few more attributes. Also, for those I want to use export, I want to create var max speed. This is going to be an integer, and this should be 500. Besides that, I want to have a normal variable, which is going to be speed. This one is going to get the max speed value by default. Also, we can be a bit more aggressive here. This speed should also be an integer. Once we have that, I can update this 500 with the speed. If I now run all of this, we are not going to see a difference, because as far as Godot is concerned, the numbers haven't changed. Speed is still 500. That being said, what we are now able to do inside of the level, when the player is entering the gate, this is happening inside of this function. I don't want to print things anymore. Instead, I want to create another variable, which is going to be the tween. And there's something I forgot to mention earlier. So far, we created a tween with getTree and then create tween. You don't actually need the first part. You can simply type create tween, and then Godot figures out the rest for you. So this is also perfectly fine. And also the more easily understandable part. So this is probably what you want to do. Next up, I want to get the tween once again, and then run tween proper t. I want to get the player node and spell this correctly as well. On that player node, I want to update the speed. The final speed should be 0, and I want to have a duration of 1 second. With that, I can run all of this again. And now if I go into this area, we cannot move anymore, although the duration was a bit too long. So let's say this one could be 0.5. And now if I run this again, in there, we cannot reach this ceiling anymore. This is exactly what I wanted. Now, right now, this is looking really silly and we are breaking the game. But later on, we're going to add a transition that the player is going to get into a different level. Although for now, we have covered another really important part, so we are good to go. Although before that, before I forget, the debugger now is unhappy again because we have this body parameter that we're not using. So let's add an underscore, and now Godot is happy again, at least I think it is. Yep, that looks good. Cool. With that, we are finished with this part.